gentlemen, please take your seats. We're going to start the next session, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the chair and moderator of this session, Arturo Sarukhan, the former ambassador from Mexico to the United States, and a consultant and speaker here in Washington, and also a member of the board of the Inter-American Dialogue, and we're very happy to turn it over to Arturo. Arturo.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes a todos. It's a pleasure to kick off this second and last panel. We're the last thing between you and reception, so we'll try and be as efficient and sexy as possible. But we have a very important topic to discuss here today, which is the relationship between the United States, the Trump foreign policy towards the Americas, and some of the inter-American dynamics as we head into the second part of a new U.S. administration. We've got a very, very good and distinguished panel. We're going to do this in Spanglish. We're going to move between English and Spanish back and forth. So bear with us as we go through the rigmarole of using two different languages throughout the discussion. You have the participants in your materials, but I just want to very quickly introduce them to you. Starting on my left, one of the most distinguished Latin American diplomats today, former foreign minister of Peru, current Peruvian ambassador to Spain, José Antonio García Belaunde. Thank you for joining us and coming from Europe to this panel. Marta Lucía Ramírez, also a former defense and trade minister, a presidential candidate, a senator, and one of the most important voices in the ongoing challenges today in Colombia. Another very prominent and distinguished Latin American diplomat, more importantly, my former colleague as Chilean ambassador here to the United States. We overlapped at the end of my term, and it was always great to work alongside Juan Gabriel Valdés, who has also been Chile's foreign minister, also Chile's ambassador to Spain, Chile's permanent rep to the UN, and last but not least, someone who has been doing yeoman's work as acting assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere, Paco Palmieri, at a very challenging moment for relations between nations throughout the Americas. Paco, thank you for your service and for what you're doing to keep the flame alive as we engage with the new U.S. administration. Vamos a tratar de que esta sesión sea lo más similar.
We're going to try to make this session be more like a conversation. We're not going to start with opening remarks. We're going to try to have more of an active discussion, as active as possible. Therefore, I will start with a few specific questions for our panelists to see whether this can get not just 5 or 10 minute talks, but rather some dynamic exchanges about inter-American relations of today.
The differences between being a recovering diplomat and a has-been, and those of my colleagues who still have to earn their wages by being diplomatic and towing the rules of engagement of diplomacy. But look, let me start with some very quick comments. There are many in this country who have forgotten the lessons of 20th century history of what happens when a xenophobic demagogue attains presidential power via democratic election. And there are many countries, as Michael Reed's very fine piece in The Economist about a Peronista on the Potomac points out, there are many countries in Latin America that sort of have seen parts of this film before. And it does open a question as to some of the challenges, as to some of the dynamics that have been unleashed by the US presidential campaign, and how these play out in our countries in terms of freedom of the press, separation of powers, the role of open societies. And this is an issue that I think will continue to play a role as the nations in the Americas engage with one another. It also, quite frankly, makes it hard for many of us who are old US hands, who have argued that despite the asymmetry in power throughout the Americas, and despite the fact that there are not always converging agendas, it behooves the nations of the Americas to work hand in hand with the United States in building a 21st century rules-based international system. And this is certainly a trying time. You look at the favorability perceptions of the United States throughout most countries in Latin America. They have nosedived in many of the countries across the region. And this is a challenge as we try and win the hearts and minds of citizens in understanding how inter-American relations need to evolve and develop. If I were to distill how Latin Americans have engaged with and looked at the United States for many, many years, I would probably, there are many other issues. I'm not saying that there aren't other issues than these three, but there have been three salient issues that sort of distill the way Latin Americans look at the relationship with the United States. Number one, immigration. Number two, drugs and thugs. And number three, Cuba. In the previous administration, we saw an important turnaround with Cuba as a result of normalization of diplomatic ties between the United States and Cuba. We saw some important shifts in counter-narcotics policies, in part because the US, I think, like many other countries in the Americas, has come to understand that the old paradigms are increasingly untenable, and also because of very concrete reasons. If you have now 9 states, 10 states in the United States that have legalized recreational uses of marijuana, it's going to be increasingly hard to ask Latin American countries to put their Churchillian quota of blood, sweat, and tears in eradicating, seizing, and interdicting marijuana in the international black markets. So there had started to be some important changes. I think the US has done some acrobatics in trying to align some of the domestic realities of its internal drug control policy with some of the changes that have been taking place in terms of international conventions and the response of many countries throughout the region. And where we had not seen too much progress was on the immigration front because of how polarized and divisive this debate is in the United States. With yesterday's deplorable and shameful decision regarding the Dreamers in DACA, I saw a tweet this morning which I think describes accurately what many of us think. Stephen Colbert, the political satirist, said, rescinding DACA to make America great again, to MAGA, is a load of caca. There's some Spanglish for you. But obviously, these three issues, Cuba, immigration, and drugs, increasingly became drivers of how Latin American public opinion in general interacted with the United States. And these are issues that have become incredibly difficult to assess how they will move forward. The region, I think, with some exceptions, Mexico is one of them. Remember that during the Trump campaign, the region was basically not mentioned. Many of you in this room, many of you leaders in Latin America will say, thank God that we weren't part of the discussion. But with the exception of Mexico, which was front and center, the political piñata of Donald Trump's campaign, some mentions of Venezuela and some mentions of Cuba, the region was generally absent from the campaigning during 2016. I think a lot of the countries right now are in a wait-and-see mode. I think the trip that Vice President Pence took to the hemisphere was important in trying to put into context some of the decisions that are being made in Washington by the administration. But obviously, all of this is having a profound impact on how Latin America is starting to understand the next steps in the relationship with the United States. The fact that TPP, a very important piece that bound several countries in the America together with the United States and in a new paradigm of pan-Pacific trade, has been thrown out the window. There's still the Pacific Alliance, which I think is one of the most important and innovative mechanisms of intra-regional cooperation that we will be discussing. But what I would love to be able to do with the panel is sort of try and have a discussion as to how the administration is rolling out its policies towards the region, what some of the main drivers of countries throughout the hemisphere seem to be in their engagement with the United States, and what spaces of cooperation or overlap exist. I would, to get us rolling, I would like to ask, given that this panel is about the Trump administration's policies towards the region, I'd like to ask Paco Palmieri, if you want to kick us off, giving us a sense of what are the main pillars of how the administration is devising the policy towards the hemisphere, what issues are being simply continued and built upon and expanded, where do you see some new innovative actions, and importantly, I think, because the budget cuts to the governmental appropriations will probably affect a host of programs and activities across the Americas, how some of this may play out. Paco.
Well, I want to start first by thanking the Development Bank for Latin America and the Inter-American Dialogue and the OAS for this invitation and for putting on the CAF conference for the 21st year. That's a real achievement and a real contribution to the policy discussions in this town. It's also an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished leaders from the region and fellow diplomats and individuals who are working hard to address the challenges in the region. I think I first want to just, Arturo, say the flame is burning brighter than ever, and there is no cause to keep it burning. This administration has made very clear its strong interest in Latin America, and it is based on, I think, values, democratic values that underline the relationships throughout this hemisphere. And the flame of freedom and democracy is burning bright, and this administration is going to continue its focus on it. And as far as the acrobatics, our gymnasts regularly win gold medals, and we're winning, and we're going to continue winning. So I think the administration is engaged very directly Latin America from the first days of taking office. The president has received a number of Latin American leaders at the White House since early January. Secretary Tillerson made his first bilateral trip to Mexico, as you know. And Vice President Pence has just completed a really successful visit to the hemisphere. I think when we look at the hemisphere, we are thinking about the partnerships that have really been created and this administration is committed to working with. And Mexico is a critical partner. If we want to promote national security and economic prosperity in this hemisphere, we have to be working with countries like Mexico and partners throughout the hemisphere. Colombia, our friends in Central America, Peru, Chile. There's no question that this administration has a clear sense that we are going to be engaged in the Western Hemisphere. And where there are problems, like the lack of fundamental human rights in Cuba, like the attack on democracy in Venezuela, this administration is not going to stand back from those challenges, because at the end of the day, those challenges have to be addressed collectively, and we have strong partners who are willing to do that in the hemisphere. I think the leadership of Peru recently in convoking the Lima Group on August 8th, the strong declaration it issued about the backsliding of democracy in Venezuela was a clear statement that the United States has partners throughout this region. We don't have to be present because we have a common vision of what we want to see in this hemisphere, and it starts with democracy. I think you're right to talk about how the trading relationships in this hemisphere need to progress. I think the Pacific Alliance is an important element of that. We have free trade agreements with all its members. Those agreements are going to be modernized and updated. They're under review. But irrespective, what those members of the Pacific Alliance are seeking to do is deepen regional economic integration among themselves, create greater trade facilitation and lower barriers so that the countries of the Pacific Alliance can realize greater economic trading relationships among themselves, and in doing so, make themselves a more competitive bloc on the global economy. And that's something I think we all see as important to economic opportunity. I'd also just like to quickly comment that this administration very quickly recognized that if we want safe, legal, and orderly migration throughout the hemisphere, the United States needs to be engaged. And in June, Vice President Pence, the Mexican Foreign Secretary Vida Garay, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Kelly, Secretary Osorio Chong held a conference on Central America in Miami to look at how we get at the underlying conditions that are driving a lot of the irregular migration in the hemisphere. And we are going to continue to work with Central American partners. I think it's an affirmation that this is not just a security challenge. We need to create greater economic opportunity. And what we all know is that the best way to build a community is to create jobs in those communities. And that's how you help people stay in their home communities where they really want to be at the end of the day. And so we'll continue to work in that area. I think I'll stop there and let some of our other panelists give their perspectives.
Thank you, Paco, for that first initial stab at laying out sort of a general template of the current administration's approach to the region. Marta Lucía, comentábamos al principio.
Marta Lucía, at the beginning we were talking, both in my opening remarks and as we just heard from Paco, we've mentioned the trip made by Vice President Pence to the region. And in fact, the first country that he visited was Colombia, an essential strategic ally of the United States in South America, and also a country with which we have extensive relations through the Free Trade Agreement, and also thanks to years of collaboration on fighting transnational organized crime through Plan Colombia. So how did you view the Vice President's interaction in Colombia, and how was he received by public opinion? What do you perceive to be the next states in further building the scaffolding of relations between Colombia and the United States? First of all, I'd like to thank the Inter-American Dialogue and Mike and CAF and the American Development Bank for the invitation to be here. Arturo said that he's just a former diplomat. I am a political person who recently got involved in politics, and I have a woman who is really trying to change the way that we conduct politics in Latin America. I'm no longer a paid diplomat, but what we're talking about here has everything to do with our future, not only for integration, but also a future of democracy, economic prosperity, and freedom for our countries. I think that Vice President Pence's visit was a friendly one and a gesture of cooperation, as Arturo says. We have had a long-standing strategic relationship with the United States. Unfortunately, I feel that in recent times, this relationship has been relegated to the past, and this is because of Colombia's situation, but also because, while it is true that Paco was talking just now about some essential issues for our future, such as economic prosperity and development so far, the international development agenda of the United States is very much characterized by three aspects. First, protectionism. Protectionism, which affects the entire world. For that reason, they suspended the TPP involvement and the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that is why the U.S. and Canada are now renegotiating NAFTA with that is to say, Mexico and Canada renegotiating NAFTA with the United States. So we're talking about economic prosperity in a time of economic isolation is a little bit a difficult equation. Next, when you talk about migration, and migration is something, well, yesterday the administrative decision was made to end DACA, and this has a different impact on each country in Latin America. Colombia does not have a big problem in terms of immigration, but for Mexico, a large part of transfers, we understand that for Mexico, it's 2.5% of their GDP. So we're talking about some $25 billion. For Colombia, it's not a big, it doesn't have a big economic impact, but this is a delicate matter. But what has happened with Colombia and the United States is the issue of drug trafficking. Drug trafficking, unfortunately, it has increased. In Colombia, there's been an increase in corruption, and for the United States, this has implications in terms of national security and also in terms of regional stability. And once again, Colombia sees that drug corruption has increased. The visit by Vice President Pence once again was obliged to look at this. And now I recall that when this issue of the hurricane arose, President Santos called President Trump to offer aid, and President Trump very kindly thanked him and said, be careful because you have to reduce your drug production. So we see that once again, it's gone back to having to an agenda of the past. Here we're not talking about economic prosperity or a strengthening of democracy or building institutions. And obviously, Colombia will have to make every effort to reduce drug production, which we warned everyone about throughout the negotiations with the trunk, and they unfortunately we're increasing production. And now, on the eve of the plebiscite, and I asked for the floor last year when we met here, and I asked Mike for the floor, and he said, what do you think? What I wanted to say that day was that we see a major risk in approving the agreement because they are not reducing drug production in Colombia, and it gives us no guarantees for the future of democracy. And now we are seeing drug trafficking money there, which poses a threat to the future of democracy in Colombia. So drug trafficking money is in the FARC's hand now. They're a legal party, and they are going to participate on an even footing with other politicians who are clean, decent, don't buy votes, and don't get money from drug trafficking. And our conviction is to strengthen institutions. So all of Colombia's agenda is very closely linked to past and future relations with the United States. The important thing is to not get trapped in the past. And we shouldn't get bogged down in drug trafficking, but have to look at cooperation. Now that the United States was so cooperative in the negotiations with the FARC, we understand that we face a joint challenge. We have to see how we can manage to ensure that Colombian democracy will not be put at risk, and we can continue to have bilateral cooperation. We know that all the money going from the drug traffickers to Venezuela and through the Caribbean, this poses a big risk for regional security, but we should work together constructively and try to focus on the issues that affect people. We should try to have cooperation that focuses on education, science, technology, development, production, and also supply chains, as Mr. Carranza said, but we should not get bogged down in the agenda of the past.
We have heard several of the panelists talking about the importance of international trade, that we have the TPP, which is very promising, the promise through the TPP and the inclusion of several countries of the Americas in this framework. And also we have the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance represented here today. I would like to ask the 2 ambassadors, we are at a crossroads. We have, as a regional way for integration that is changing paradigms, the mechanisms for integration that used to be the norm in the region are changing. The Pacific Alliance has generated great expectations, which we can see given the number of observer countries that have joined into the mechanism. But and Paco, I'm sorry to go back to that same issue, but the reality is that the United States is now revising trade agreements. They are renegotiating NAFTA. The second round of negotiations ended yesterday morning. And that's when the declarations of the 3 involved ministers were issued. So this would be a contradiction of what we had been building in the Americas, which was a coalition of the free trade willing with the United States going back with respect to the free trade agreements. Maybe Juan Gabriel and Jose would like to take the floor now. So how do you see the role of the Pacific Alliance here, and what will happen with this vacuum that could be generated given what the United States is doing right now? So are the countries of the TPP to continue forward even without the United States? So where will this debate be heading to in Peru, Chile, Colombia? Please, I don't know which one of you would like to go first. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank CAF and the dialogue. And the good thing of being older and having been in the diplomatic service for many years, we learn to say things a different way, but we still say what we want to say. And so I will say this. Let's start at the beginning. We need to distinguish terms. When we talk about Latin America, we are loose with our terminology. There are many different realities, but in the relationship between the United States and different countries, there are different ways of dealing with things. If we take the famous case of the free trade area of the Americas, it existed. It was there. Brazil, Argentina, the people from the Bolivarians and those who didn't want to join in, then they didn't, and those who did. So there is not one single Latin America, and there is not one single recipe for each area or country of the of Latin America. The same thing goes for drugs. There has been not a great deal of involvement of the United States toward Peru and drugs. So there is a difference also policy-wise. Regarding the Pacific Alliance, there is a new paradigm that is being created, and that new paradigm is that we have started from what we agree upon. Marta Lucía, the trade minister, when she was trade minister, that's when we met. At that point in time, they were trying to relaunch the Andean community, but in the end, the break point was the negotiation first with the United States and then with Europe. In both cases, we started out being 4 and we ended up being only 2. Why? Because we simply didn't have the same criteria. Some of us believed in integration in the processes of negotiation. So both Colombia and us believed in it, and Bolivia and Ecuador didn't. So there is an agreement between the U.S. and Colombia and with Peru, and there is an agreement with Peru and Colombia with the European Union, and then recently joined in by Ecuador. But, we cannot make blanket statements. The importance of the Pacific Alliance is that it left behind the rhetoric that came from history or the founding fathers, etc. So we just went to this. So who are the like-minded people who want to advance here? And we've done it, and we will continue to do so. I have the impression that the current administration is really not relevant for our projects, for the Pacific Alliance, partly because I think that the foreign policy, in other words, Latin America, is still far away from the United States, and specifically this administration, perhaps with the exception of Mexico. We thought that there were some issues that were being overcome, but as Marta Lucía said, we're going back to them. And also there is the paradoxical issue of Cuba. Cuba was kind of an example of galvanizing Latin American policies vis-a-vis the United States. But the moment the sanctions were lifted or started to be lifted, one of those disturbing elements was removed in the global relationship, and there is freedom to build things. And finally, another point I wanted to make was that not only the Pacific Alliance is an interesting model for the region or the United States, but it is also so for Europe, a Europe that I have been living through the European process. They have been responding to the two great challenges they've had, Brexit on the one hand, and today it is clear what Europe wants, but it's not as clear what Great Britain wants, and also the relationship with the United States, or the role of the United States in the world, and the gaps and the vacuum they are creating. So the Pacific Alliance has a great deal of opportunity. They know what they want to do, and I think others will understand this to be the case as well. I've always said, and I think we agree on this, the premise behind the Pacific Alliance and TPP itself is that, as opposed to other schemes, this scheme involves those who want to be in and not those we want to exclude from this framework. It's open to all of those who want to raise their hand and say, yes, I want to play, and I am going to follow those rules. And thank you, because one of the questions I had for you is, how were you seeing this from the other side of the Atlantic, some of these issues? But Juan Gabriel Chile, together with Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, have a competition going here to see who wins in terms of how many trade pacts and treaties we have all over the world. So there have been a series of free trade agreements. Chile has benefited from not being on the targets of attack from the trade policy of the current government. But it is clear from what we have seen from the chorus, the Korea-U.S. treaty, that there is the idea to make revisions, deeper revisions on the trade agreements that the U.S. has with many other countries. So in your new interactions, how do you feel things are going? How are the integration mechanisms developing for commercial integration in the region with the new administration? Well, first of all, I would like to thank CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue for the invitation. I am very happy to be invited again to this meeting and share my ideas. The relationship with Chile and the United States was based on two essential concepts after the dictatorship was overthrown. It had to do with trade, and it gave way to friendship and development of a constructive relationship and a complicity, if I may use that word, which had never been seen in our history before. In the history of Chile and the United States, there had never been a period where there had been such a closer relationship and with more cooperation. That was the period after Pinochet was ousted and what happened until the end of the Obama administration. The change that was more remarkable was the change related to trade, and something that had not been easy for Chile to accept, which is the TPP, because we have trade agreements with all the TPP members individually on an individual basis. So to join a larger agreement with all the countries all together was not only a repetition of what we had already done, but it was a greater effort, which it increased the demands, which affected the trade agreement with the United States that had been in force for 11 years. The efforts at negotiating that agreement were very difficult, challenging, and so the conditions are different now. There's more resistance. They are different. There are sectors that win and those who lose, and therefore the negotiation toward the TPP was very challenging. To find the surprise that there will no longer be a TPP was, of course, a surprising fact. Now, the seriousness or the gravity of the impact, well, I think that Chile, both as a member of the Pacific Alliance or as a country, this has not been an obstacle to continue doing what they has been doing. Our relationship with China and the rest of the members of the TPP continues to be the same as before, and we are in a process where we reflect as to whether to continue ahead and sign the TPP, subscribe to the TPP. Eventually, the U.S. sooner or later will become a member of it. So we wonder, our free trade agreement is well regarded. It is a quality agreement, and it also has a $10 billion surplus for the United States, which is considered a significant fact in these times. From the standpoint of Chile, we have an agreement that is stable. But if you were to ask me, and when I was told whether I could speak in English or in Spanish, and I thought how I would say this, from Chile, how would you rate the current phenomenon, the current logic of the relationship between the United States and Latin America? And I would say that if I had to say it in English, I would say it somewhat bumpy continuity. In Spanish, it could be a stormy continuity or a bumpy continuity, in other words, because if you take a look at Cuba, the policy toward Cuba established by President Obama is maintained as such in general. Now, the work that has been positive and with the State Department, with the United States to condemn the Maduro administration and making sure that human rights are respected in that country. All of this continues except for a declaration that President Trump made, and which, from the standpoint of Latin America, it belongs in a different century even. It's something that belongs, I repeat, to another century. To say those words nowadays, it is inconceivable to say that today. And Latin America's reaction was what it had to be, a categorical no to the even mentioning that possibility. But other than that, we understand that with respect to Venezuela, we have an agreement with the United States to advance, to go forward, exercising pressure so that some kind of dialogue and peaceful solution can be arrived at. Secondly, if we take a look at some other things that are interesting and exciting and positive, is the relationship with Argentina. The trip by President Obama was very interesting too. But yes, it can be bumpy if we think of, or we hear words where subsidies are being criticized for the biodiesel subsidies in Argentina, or Argentina will be denied certain tariff advantages to solve the situation left by President Macri. The situation as trying to be resolved by President Macri. So there is a continuity, and we are happy with that continuity. The visit of Vice President Pence has helped us to see that that continuity is valid, and that continuity allows us to continue working together with support to Central America, which is vital for the countries of South America, and also within the framework of friendship and respect and basically cooperation that we have had in the past. And as a final point, it is and I don't want to be neutral here. There is a going back by the United States in putting their conditions on the table as being accepted by Latin American countries. There is this going back in the relations with Latin America, and I come from a generation that for many years made great efforts to reestablish the relationship between Chile and the United States and recreate it in the best way possible. Today, we see an anti-imperialistic discourse that seemed to be buried for many years, but we need to face this reality, and I am convinced that there are resources both in the United States and the will in the United States as well as in Latin America to maintain this relationship at the level where it has to be, with quality, with cooperation, with honesty, and hopefully with a desire to be responsible in dealing with the problems of the region. Yes, you and Paco have mentioned the hot button, which is Venezuela at this point in time.
Very important story. In part, it's happened because I think a number of countries throughout the region have finally taken their head out of the sand and understood that the Westphalian view of, oh no, this is national sovereignty and non-intervention, countries have started to understand, mine included, that this position was untenable. But there's been sort of there's been a meeting of minds and of efforts, which Ambassador Valdés was talking about, which you referred to. How do you see the coalition building, the quiet, careful coalition building that has been taking place, some of it not even triggered by the United States, but driven by the worries and concerns of Latin American countries as to how to engage with the Venezuelan crises?
Yeah, I think Vice President Pence's tour of Latin America helped demonstrate that we are engaged in a conversation with like-minded countries, whether they see the problem in Venezuela exactly the way we do, or that we need to have a conversation with them. And I think Ambassador Valdés is right that it's always got to be based in this idea that it's respectful and that it takes place across the table where both sides can talk frankly. The Vice President, I think, made two really important points on his trip with respect to our approach. And the first is, America first does not mean America alone. And we are working, whether it's been in the OAS over the last 18 months, where now there are more than 20 or 20 countries representing more than 90% of the population of the hemisphere who've staked out a clear position that the Inter-American Charter and the Democratic Charter of the OAS means something to this hemisphere. And we can't ignore, individually or collectively, what is going on in Venezuela. And the point that Vice President Pence made in each stop about working with our allies in the region to find a peaceful solution to the crisis is really underlines how we are approaching Venezuela. We want to see Venezuelan democratic institutions respected. We want to see the regime in Venezuela honor the commitments it's made in previous negotiations. Because the only solution in Venezuela is one that Venezuelans arrive at. And what the United States is prepared to do, however, is in the face of increasing authoritarianism by a regime that is ignoring its democratic institutions, we will preserve our options to act unilaterally and impose sanctions both on individuals who are engaged in the repression or the corruption of people inside Venezuela, or through sectoral sanctions, so that the regime cannot continue to impoverish the future of the country with these debt instruments to continue its lifelines. And so I think the Vice President made clear we want a peaceful solution. That's the preferred outcome. But we can't stand by, and the United States will not stand by and just let Venezuelan democracy disappear. I mean, I had the great fortune of living in Venezuela after college, and anyone who knows a Venezuelan knows that democracy is baked into the DNA of Venezuelans now. And earlier today we were talking about it, and an analyst pointed out that 70% of Venezuelans see elections as the vehicle for the solution to the crisis. But those elections have to be free, fair. They can't be fraudulent the way the Constituent Assembly results were manipulated. And we're going to have to ensure that that ability to express democratically on the part of the Venezuelan people is somehow preserved. And I think there is a growing consensus in this hemisphere that we need to address it. And the United States is going to be a part of that.
José or Marta Lucía, would you like to jump in on the Venezuela discussion?
Yo solo quería anotar dos cosas. Primero que creo que
I just wanted to say that the Lima document is one of the most important documents that have been written in coordination and cooperation among Latin American countries for the purposes of recovering and preserving democracy. I think this is a very strong, clear document which is quite precise in its wording, and I had never seen this before. And I wanted to add a small historical reflection. And we are looking for history here. We are in the search for history. So in the Lima group, I don't know what the formal name is, but the group of countries that signed the document whilst in Lima, it gathers a tradition which is very important. First, it was the Contadora group, and then the support group to Contadora, and it was the participation by those countries in Central America which allowed the processes to work toward democracy and give a solution from Latin America, because the temptation is great to have a solution be coming vertically from the United States. But no, here there is a space where Latin American countries are going to play a role, and this is significant. We are recovering a tradition, but we are doing it quite firmly. And I was quite surprised after reading the Lima document. Another issue that I think dovetails with the question to Marta Lucía, and of course Colombia is a neighboring country to Venezuela. If there is an implosion socially and politically in Venezuela, then Colombia will have a big problem in terms of flows of displaced persons and border security. And I wanted to go back to this because it's important, not only taking into account the DACA decision yesterday, but also other issues with the internally displaced people and refugees and people who have to leave their place, have to go away from their home because of drug issues, violence, etc. There will be a forum for specifically dealing with the issues of migration. As to what Tupaco said, I think the Venezuelan issue needs to be dealt with great responsibility in terms of human lives and also deterioration of the conditions of living in Venezuela. And the human rights issue is quite difficult and challenging. People are just playing ball with this, and I agree with José Lugo. The document is very important. The Lima document is important. But we should take initiative, and we should assign some immigration quotas from Venezuela, because today we need to take a look at what was done in Europe and Germany.
Colombia is now asking for this at the OAS. Each Latin American country should accept a quota of migrants from Venezuela for a temporary time, at least for a year and a half, while we see what happens in Venezuela. Second, to guarantee work, access to employment and everything, because what's happening in that country is very difficult for those people. And the U.S. leadership on this is very important. But each of our countries also has to take responsibility. We must strengthen the OAS as a mechanism for dialogue and solutions. I know we're aware of the Democratic Charter, and the role of Central America and the Caribbean was very important in this, and they could not reach a consensus. But the United States is going to have to work on this outside the region, because there are many issues of international geopolitics involved here. For example, the decision recently made by the U.S. to prevent the sale of dead papers and impose some trade constrictions, and the Russian oil company that wants to buy Citgo assets, so all of these are international geopolitical issues that the U.S. has to discuss with its allies outside the region to pressure everyone to accept a peaceful and swift resolution to the crisis in Venezuela. Now, of course, this affects Colombia. We're affected by migration because it's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and we are left impotent. Secondly, Colombia in the past also suffered this being stigmatized, that we're a problem that posed a threat to security and stability in the hemisphere. Now, not so much they're a drug trafficking site, but now all of drug trafficking problems poses a danger to the security of Venezuela and to Colombia as well. So many people who so complacently allow all of these violations of human rights in Venezuela there, and they also are complacent knowing that the FARC was involved with drug trafficking forever. And we see on the Venezuelan side, we have FARC people who are now called dissidents, people from the ELN, drug traffickers, and a bunch of people armed to the teeth. And they have weapons from these groups on the Venezuelan side of the border. As I said before, a tremendous risk that a lot of the drug trafficking money in Venezuela is being used to influence politics and democracy in Colombia. We're going to do a selection next year that is going to be important. If the new Colombian government is inclined to be complacent, or if it lends itself to populism, then we will have very bitter times ahead of us in the region. If, on the contrary, we elect a government that continues to be committed to peace, but in a way that's geared to strengthen institutions, the rule of law, law enforcement, and bring about economic development, then we'll have a different future for both Colombia and the region. So it really depends in large measure, on what happens in Venezuela as well. Yes, there is something that we just heard from Marta Lucía that's very important about the conditions that the U.S. needs to help bring about regarding its partners. But I would say that's not only for now, but we also have to think of a post-Maduro scenario. We have to think about what will happen with the tremendous Venezuelan debt and who holds it right now, and how we can work on this situation, because it's a terrible situation. If you would allow me to add something regarding the role of a few countries outside of the hemisphere who have a lot at stake regarding what's happening in Venezuela right now. I would like to give the audience some time to ask questions. Michael has asked me to conclude by 6 o'clock sharp. I see the time is running out, but when I was looking at some surveys this morning, as I was coming to the conference, a couple of them really struck me, and perhaps I'll use them as a crutch to see whether they can bring out some final comments from this very good panel of colleagues. The first is, now these are both the Pew Research Institute polls. They're trying to tease out the perception of the public opinion in Latin America, or the world in general, but I was looking at the data for the Latin American countries regarding the biggest threat faced by their citizens. We should not be surprised to see that 10 of the 14 most diverse countries of the world are in the Americas. So for Latin American citizens, climate change and environmental degradation are viewed as the biggest threats to security of the region. So once again, this is occurring when we have an administration that has taken steps backward in terms of its commitments to stopping climate change. So we see whether this does or does not lend itself towards working together on issues which most of the Latin American public perceives to be the biggest threat to the well-being and prosperity of their countries. And the next is one of my favorite topics because many Latin American countries have tremendous soft power. We do not know how to exercise it or assert it. The U.S. has always been a country with tremendous power to ability to project soft power, but the United States now is not going through its best times. There's been a significant drop in the U.S.'s favorability rating around the world. Latin America is no exception. And curiously, as I was looking over the data, I see that in Latin America, the two countries towards the top are Colombia and Peru in terms of favorability ratings. Colombia and Peru get about 20% unfavorability ratings for the U.S., but 51% have favorable perceptions. This is followed by Brazil with 25% of the public that has unfavorable perception of the U.S. and 50% has a favorable perception. So once again, there's no surprise that Mexico is at the bottom of the list. 65% of the public has an unfavorable view of the United States, and only 30% of Mexican public opinion has a favorable view of the United States. So again, this greatly complicates an approach to many things, including the maneuvering room that the Mexican government will have as they close up the NAFTA renegotiations, and also since Mexican elections are coming up. These figures don't give the Mexican government any room to make any decisions that may be very unpopular within its borders, or to raise up any other issues that the countries of the region might interact with the U.S. on. If you have these kinds of numbers and differences in perceptions of what they view to be the most important and relevant things, and some of the measures by the Trump administration on these same issues. So I'd like to see whether you have any final comments on that. I'd like to see who'd like to speak. With that, we'll close up this forum and then hear questions from the audience. I would like to react to that with two observations. The first is that it's very true that when you say that there is not a single Latin America, and that Latin America is a set of different viewpoints. You may draw a distinction, as the Brazilians have so skillfully done, between South America and North America. However, it is apparent that there are certain things that affect the whole in different ways. I would like to say that at least from my perspective, looking from the South, what's happening with NAFTA and what's happening in that negotiations with Mexico is going to be very important in terms of how other countries of the region, particularly in South America, read how trade is evolving in the hemisphere and globally. So there is a factor that we're all observing with great interest. A second thing has to do with the environment. But it leads me to something that a Mexican like Arturo knows all too well. For some curious reason, Chile and Mexico have developed a relationship with the United States that goes beyond administrations. Mexicans very well understand that the United States is a cosmos of different beliefs, different states that work in different ways and have different perceptions. For example, very different views of the environment. And we, over the course of time, have come to understand, for example, since we established an agreement between Chile and California in the 1970s that completely changed the industry of Chilean wine, which was very important for us, or which changed Chilean agriculture, because this was behind the agrarian reform. UC Davis was so important for Chilean land reform, like the University of Chicago was for other more conflictive issues. So I would like to say that Chile, since it established a relationship with California, that a relationship with the state of Texas or the state of Massachusetts could become something of fundamental importance for the development of science, education, medicine, or agriculture in a country such as ours. Or, to say it in terms of today's terms, for a complete transformation of the energy industry. I think that this is tremendously important because it has to do with what's happening today. Not just Chile and countries in Latin America in general has not only said this about the Paris Accord and have not budged an inch regarding what has been done with the global warming and the need to take decisions such as which was recommended by the Paris Accord and to even go beyond this. But furthermore, we've signed agreements with U.S. states on this very same topic, which has very important consequences for our own development in terms of protection against global warming, which is having tremendous impacts in our countries. So I am not trying to diminish the importance of any disagreements with the federal government or administration in Washington. Each party has its own decisions to make, but the U.S. is much more vast than one administration. You could strengthen your relationship with the United States on an issue even in which you have discrepancies with a particular administration. I underscore this because this has to do with surveys and how we look at these issues. Marta Lucía, in Colombia, we have a very good opinion about the relationship with the United States because it is a relationship with over the last 3 decades has been marked by cooperation, mutual respect, and a very constructive action. So I am a bit disconcerted, or we are, about what's going to happen and what's going to happen with drug trafficking. We have to go back to the very low standards we have in terms of drug protection. This is very unfortunate, what's happened in that area for us, but we always hope that this relationship will be on the soft agenda. We want more cooperation in education, science, technology, and development of a different production sector, a production apparatus that might enable us to have a greater international market presence. But the issue on the environment, I think that this, like in other topics, Latin America and Colombia in particular, doesn't need to be so dependent on what happens in the United States. Unfortunately, it seems that the U.S. is withdrawing a bit from multilateralism because I personally think that the multilateral system gives you more guarantees in the long term for handling certain issues. But if the U.S. withdraws from the Paris Accord, for example, well, Latin America needs to develop an agenda that will ensure environmental sustainability. I think that at this point in time, the U.S. is not perceiving the strategic importance of its relationship with Latin America. It should see tremendous potential there. This hosts one of the biggest reserves of biosphere, but we're also very vulnerable to climate change. The United States may have withdrawn, but we have to continue with our agenda. And this also applies to trade. As Jose was saying, a couple of you have said this. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We think that this is an excellent mechanism for those of us who believe in this and want to be involved in this and know that there is no other way to ensure prosperity than through economic development, growth, and private investment, and opening our countries to the world and allowing our penetration into the international market. With this, we have to do not only with the Pacific Partnership, but it also depends on what happens between the United States, with the United States and its NAFTA partners. We might pursue something more ambitious, which if Muhammad doesn't come to the mountain, and maybe we have to bring the mountain to Muhammad. We have to maybe think about the possibility of an agreement between the TPP and NAFTA, and perhaps in this way we can move forward with this kind of integration. In Colombia, opinions of the United States are positive. It's a strategic relationship, and while it is true that we have gone through various administrations, and with the United States, there has bipartisan support for us. And I think we need to focus more on the soft agenda, values, democracy, human rights, and, of course, economic prosperity. José Antonio, I would just like to say one thing. There's another issue here that's come up in other surveys, because there are surveys on everything, or polls on everything. In Latin America has 43 of the 50 highest crime cities in the world. And this is something that truly affects all of our efforts to attain development and prosperity. And so I just wanted to add in that tidbit. Paco.
Said it really well. And I'm an optimist about the ebb and flow of American popularity around the globe. There's no question that when I started this business, more than 30 years ago, in another period serving in Central America, there was a lot of concern about the role the United States played. I think now, today, in the hemisphere, there's an understanding because of the way the United States is willing to engage its partners from the southern cone of South America to our neighbors to the north, Canada, in conversations that address the real problems affecting real people's lives. And when we talk about security issues in the hemisphere, we're concerned about the violence in local communities, right? Where we see these, horrific levels of homicides occurring. I think the other thing that ultimately binds us is you look around our country, and it still is very much a melting pot. You see throughout communities everywhere in the United States a Hispanic Latino presence, and it's not going away. And I think ultimately those connections will bind the United States to the hemisphere. Those personal, cultural, individual, familial relationships are every bit as important as what governments do. And in the long run, the ability for communities throughout this hemisphere to express that criticism of the United States is what binds this hemisphere together and makes it different than all these other spots in the world that are dealing with much more difficult, violent problems. In this hemisphere, we have learned to talk to each other, to work with each other, and to see a common political and economic vision. And I think that's going to endure. Bumpy continuity is one perspective on it, but there is going to be continuity, and I choose to be optimistic about the U.S. role in the hemisphere.
Thank you, Paco. I'm going to ask Michael, given that we started late, that we have at least 5-10 more additional minutes. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We're going to take packages of 3 questions. The only thing I've been asked to ask you is that when you ask your question, stand up. Apparently, the gentlemen in the booth need to be able to see you for purposes of the interpretation. So if you can stand up, just say who you are and be brief. Whatever you say, it has to be followed by a question mark, please. Denise.
Someone on the panel said that there was an elephant in the room and that elephant was Venezuela. I disagree. The elephant in the room is the name of this panel, Trump's foreign policy towards Latin America. Is there a foreign policy towards Latin America? The representative of the Trump administration is the acting Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs because no one has been named. And I think that says a lot. Just like there is not only one Latin America, there's not one Trump administration and not one U.S. position towards Latin America. And however much I appreciate your emphasis on collaboration, cooperation, and how the U.S.'s reputation in the region will survive, as a Mexican, I can tell you that the numbers that Arturo Sarukhan cited in terms of the anti-Americanism growing in Mexico are very reflective of what's happening there and what's happening in the region. And certainly in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, there is no continuity. There is a huge break with the past. And that break is the possible termination of NAFTA and the way in which every time Donald Trump tweets about Mexico, our currency falls. So my question is, what is Donald Trump's foreign policy towards Latin America and towards its NAFTA neighbor?
Back there. I don't have control of the mic, so just bear with me. Who has the mic now?
Hi. Thank you for being here today. My name is Isabel Hoagland. I'm with Inside U.S. Trade. Ambassador Valdés, when speaking about TPP, you said you were confident that the U.S. will eventually become a member. Have you received any indication from this administration that this is a possibility? And then lastly, going off of the last question, I would love it if Ms. Ramirez, you could elaborate on the NAFTA talks, considering the second round just concluded, and elaborate further on pursuing something more ambitious.
Sorry, the second question was addressed to whom?
Ms. Ramirez? Ms. Ramirez?
A ti. Okay.
¿A quién, perdón?
Marta Lucía.
My question is addressed to Minister Ramirez. You mentioned the great economic reaches of the FARC thanks to drug trafficking. So my question is it safe to think that there's a campaign reform is in the future for Colombia? And if so, how do you plan to deal with the congressmen that the FARC will have in the future?
So we've got three questions. Paco, what's the foreign policy of the administration towards Latin America? Gabriel, TPP and U.S. participation in Alianza del Pacífico and U.S. participation in that. And I understood that the NAFTA question was addressed to Marta Lucía, and then this last question on Colombia.
Yeah, so very quickly, our approach, the administration approach to foreign policy is based on some pretty basic fundamentals. We are first and foremost going to promote and protect U.S. national security. And secondly, we're going to work to expand economic prosperity. We think we can do both of those things in the hemisphere. And I think the administration's approach is to work with our partners in the region on both of those issues. And we will continue to do that. Now, with respect to Mexico specifically, I think everyone who's looked at the NAFTA agreement would agree that it needs to be modernized. It needs to be updated. And that's exactly what's happening in these negotiations. And I'm not gonna talk for the U.S. Trade representative about the ebb and flow of those talks from one session to the next. But within that context of promoting U.S. national security and promoting economic prosperity, the president has said, yes, we want free trade agreements, but we want them to be fair. We want to make sure that they enable trade and that they enhance the ability of U.S. companies to export. And I think that's what they're going to try and do.
You quoted me about the TPP, and let me say that what I said exactly was I'm convinced, it is my personal opinion, that at some point the United States will come back to the TPP. And I think that this is a simple recognition of what the real interests of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific area are. I have not been informed by the U.S. administration of any change in its policy. I'm sorry to say.
Marta Lucía.
I'm not sure whether the second half of the question regarding the NAFTA negotiation rounds was related to me. I'm not involved in that. I really don't know how those talks are going. I hope it goes well and continues. I hope that the whole integration process goes forward, which has been so useful for Mexico and for the United States as well. Now, on your point regarding the foreign policy, I would be so bold as to say that we truly need for politics, that there's a U.S. policy to bear in mind the importance of Latin America, and there are very valuable opportunities that are not being taken advantage of when there are individual bilateral relations with each country. Despite the fact that there isn't a single Latin America, I hope that the U.S. can show an overall regional vision to tap into our potential in terms of natural resources and to provide food security for a large part of the world and industrial development. But all of this will depend on how we merge the issues of NAFTA and other separate agreements throughout the hemisphere. I think the TPP is very important, and merging that with NAFTA would be important. I think that Latin America, we can look at all of these institutions, such as UNASUR and CELAC. We have to look at that in the future. We have to see whether that really makes sense. And the question from over there as to whether there can be changes vis-a-vis the agreements with the FARC, and in the next presidential campaign, I think that at this point in time, Colombia is at a great watershed moment. If we elect a populist government, or a government that is more inclined to be center-left, then there will be a setback in many areas in Colombia. If we get an extreme right government, we would also have setbacks, unfortunate setbacks in Colombia. Colombia needs a much more centrist government that aims to strengthen institutions and the rule of law and fight against drug trafficking, not because the U.S. asks for it, but rather because it is our conviction. We don't want drug trafficking in Colombia. It has harmed our economy, our government institutions. We hope that the next administration in Colombia will fight against corruption, build institutions, and in favor of economic development. The next administration we have, regardless of which political part of the spectrum it represents, there will be a change. Now, I don't think that they could reject the agreement with the FARC. That would be senseless. We've demobilized 6,000 people. We need to continue this, but we can't just allow them to trample on our Constitution, our institutions, and above all, law enforcement is essential so that Colombian policy in the future will not be taken over by the people who've worked against our institutions and our laws. I think that we have a question over here, another there, and down there. I'm not sure where the microphones are, so whoever gets the microphone first, ask your question. Germán Toro, I'm the president of the Venezuelan American Chamber of Commerce in Caracas, and I have a question for the panel. What role do you think can be played by the search for universal education throughout the hemisphere and cooperation amongst our countries in the search for universal education throughout the hemisphere, beyond the programs that U.S. already has on a bilateral basis with our different countries? How do you think this would contribute to responding to all of the challenges we've been discussing here?
Nicolás Alonso from El País newspaper. A short question, brief. Has the White House has lost the trust, and is it less of an authority in the world stage? And also, talking about the military option in Venezuela, which was rejected not only by the Latin American countries and other countries, but also Trump's cabinet, and the renegotiation of NAFTA and things that affect not only Latin America, but other conflicts, and conflicts such as North Korea and others. So you who are members of the diplomatic corps, how are these messages being perceived? These contradictions, how are they perceived in the presidential residence in other countries, in the administrations of other countries, by diplomats in other countries? Have you gotten used to a country, to a president that is so different from what we've seen before that you cannot take him seriously? Yes, Alejandro Lara. I was born and raised in Colombia, and the other half of my life I have spent in this country. A question for Mr. Palmieri is as follows. Given that you seem to understand and have clarity about the strategy of this administration, and you know, or seem to know where it's heading to, and given that you're very optimistic of where we're going to in this administration, I would like you to explain, or I would like to understand better, if you can help me, if I can also be optimistic knowing that at the same time I am being stabbed on the back, or in other words, do I help the countries in their strategy, but at the same time I'm cutting off their funding? So I want to understand what this means. I want to be optimistic, but I don't want to be backstabbed at the same time. There is a question specifically for you, Paco. This last question regarding the cuts, the budget cuts for the region, and a question for the whole panel regarding the impact and credibility of the weight of what that means for countries in Latin America. And there was also an issue related to education. So, Paco, would you like to start with your question?
The budget process in the United States has required us to really look at what our priorities are, and to in a constrained budget environment, be very clear about where we are going to put that money to those priorities. And I think if you look at the president's budget submission for 2018, we have focused on those countries and areas that have been the historic priorities for our assistance programs in this hemisphere, albeit at the more constrained and reduced levels of funding that are available. We will continue to work with Mexico and to promote the efforts that have been advanced through the Merit Initiative. Central America will remain a priority. We are the beneficiary of 2 years of significant appropriations in the previous 2 years, with that money now coming online. So while we have less money available in this budget, Central America is a priority and will receive a significant amount of funding as we move forward to address the underlying conditions in Central America that are resulting in the levels of violence in communities and outbound migration. We will continue to stand by Colombia, and we will work in the Caribbean with our Caribbean partners to address issues of safety and security there, as well. It's a constrained budget environment, there's no question. Difficult choices have to be made. Priorities have to be clear. I think the president's budget does that, and we certainly at the Department of State, working with our embassies in the field, will do our level best to execute and implement those programs in the most effective and efficient way we can.
Bueno, yo creo que el estilo es el hombre, decía Buffon, ¿no? O sea que más allá de lo que de este nuevo estilo de hacer política, etcétera, hay que entender, ver las grandes líneas. Y yo sí creo que hay grandes líneas. La política con América Latina termina en México hasta el momento, y yo no percibo que vaya a haber más cosas. Y hay otras cosas que son muy ideológicas. El tema del comercio es absolutamente ideológico. Salirse del TPP es dispararse a los pies. Juan Gabriel decía que él pensaba que Chile no debía estar en el TPP. Yo pienso que Perú tampoco debe estar en el TPP. ¿Por qué? Porque es un ingreso a mercados pagando mucho más alto. ¿Por qué? Por la protección al conocimiento. ¿Quién genera más conocimiento? No nosotros, es Estados Unidos. Y si Estados Unidos no quiere el TPP, se está disparando los pies, creo yo. Yo que tengo acuerdos con mis principales socios comerciales, ¿por qué voy a pagar más en un TPP? Si ya tengo acceso a mercado americano, japonés, chino, etcétera, que es lo que más me interesa. Entonces sí, yo creo que hay cosas claras, que hay diseños muy claros y hay que saber leer esos diseños, que están muy prefigurados en la campaña misma, pero que han sido... Lo que a mí me sorprende más bien es el tipo de respuestas que puede haber. Y a mí me impresiona muy bien esa especie de dúo, ¿no? de baile muy inteligente que hace la señora Merkel con el señor Macron, tratando de cubrir ese espacio que pareciera dejar Estados Unidos. Y esto lo están haciendo muy bien. Pero yo sí creo que dejemos de lado lo anecdótico y hay líneas maestras que sí se entienden. Gracias.
Marta Lucía o Juan Gabriel.
Yo quisiera decir algo sobre el tema de la educación, pero quiero aprovechar la pregunta para hacer una reflexión sobre el tema de la integración en la región. Porque, yo creo que nosotros hemos resuelto ya la mirada arcaica sobre la integración, ya sea como un fenómeno bolivariano, significaría otra cosa que lo que quiero decir. O sea, quiero decir, como un fenómeno que responde al llamado de nuestros padres fundadores, que en realidad es un romanticismo que no corresponde a la época, o bien como una especie de ejercicio arancelario, que era el otro extremo, en el cual si tú me bajas los tomates y yo bajo los neumáticos, entonces estamos procediendo a ser más integrados. Es evidente que la integración económica es fundamental y en ese sentido la Alianza del Pacífico, ya bien se ha dicho aquí, es un episodio y es una construcción distinta con una calidad y con una ambición de calidad diferente a lo que hemos hecho en la región en el pasado. Y parte de esa calidad y parte de ese proceso de renovación o de innovación en el proceso de integración tiene que ser una voluntad política para asociarnos en temas como la educación, las contrataciones a través de fronteras, la generación de proyectos binacionales o trinacionales o lo que sea, conjuntos de desarrollo de determinadas áreas productivas, el desarrollo de infraestructura. Ese tipo de procesos es lo que yo creo que está en deuda nuestra región. Y desde ese punto de vista, la Alianza del Pacífico puede ser un vehículo muy importante para acelerar los procesos de educación común, generar una complicidad y un trabajo conjunto entre universidades que hoy día, desgraciadamente, no lo tenemos, porque tenemos muchos convenios, pero son la mayoría de ellos convenios de papel. Por lo tanto, hay que avanzar mucho en eso. Respecto del tema de la presencia de Estados Unidos en nuestros países, yo no voy a entrar en la opinión pública porque basta con mirar el Pew Research Institute, que acaba de hacer una encuesta hace un mes atrás, nos la fueron a presentar sobre el impacto que ha tenido los procesos recientes en Estados Unidos sobre la imagen de Estados Unidos sobre nuestros países. Yo ya dije que no me parecía algo para alegrarse. Pero sí tengo que decir que desde el punto de vista de nuestro trabajo profesional y de la manera como nosotros estamos mirando el desarrollo futuro, nosotros seguimos pensando y vamos a pensar de que nuestra relación con Estados Unidos es absolutamente fundamental para nosotros y para nuestros intereses. Por lo tanto, nosotros vamos a buscar todas las oportunidades que sean necesarias para ir avanzando en construir instituciones, en fortalecer las instituciones que ya tenemos y en defender los principios comunes que han alimentado las dos partes de esta ecuación desde sus fundaciones: derechos humanos, democracia, libre comercio en el mundo.
Marta Lucía, no.
If I could just
Yeah.
jump in with a quick point here. And as fundamental as that relationship for you is with us, it's equally fundamental for the United States in this hemisphere with the countries of this hemisphere. We do more trade in the Western Hemisphere than we do with Asia. Our bread is buttered in this hemisphere because we have these economic relationships. And so it's important to the United States to maintain those relationships as well in all of these in all of the countries of the region. And it's definitely a two-way street.
Marta Lucía.
Sobre el punto que mencionaba Juan Gabriel en relación.
Regarding what Juan Gabriel was saying with respect to integration, as said by Juan Gabriel, we need to refer back to the IRSA project, the Mesoamerica project. There are many areas of integration where we could really make a great deal of progress without having the good example of the Pacific Alliance, and it is connected with education to the extent that we should be taking better advantage of IT, technology, information to create a network of education that public universities at first and then private universities could have exchange programs offering access to higher and technical vocational education to all youths of the hemisphere. Universal education means that everyone has access to education in public universities, but there need to be agreements by the government so that there is a accreditation, double degrees, so that the degrees obtained in virtual programs can be accredited, and there can be access to education, and this is connected to the productive sector. What does the productive sector for our countries needs to generate those higher levels of productivity? How that potential that President Carranza was talking about that we have in resources, natural resources, in agriculture and cattle raising, they need specialized knowledge, zootechnics, food safety. All of these things should be part of an educational agreement that will make our integration be true. Integration cannot only be focused on trade and tariffs. It should be an integration that will allow us to have a value added with better development and a better future for all of us in the hemisphere.
Flashcards here every 2 seconds to stop. So, but before we do, I'd ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a great vote.